Shalom and howdy. My name is Al, and we are continuing with our presentation today, Part 9, The Seed of the Woman and How Satan Works. If you remember from the last video, we talked about how the man and the woman were kicked out of the garden because of the judgment of Yahweh the Almighty. They end up out of the garden, and you have the man, you have his woman. And something is lacking that was in the garden over here. And what is that? Is that now they have no more Holy Spirit. They are only made, formed, and they breathe. And when that last breath goes, they're dead. They don't even live one day. One day, they can't even make it one day, but a day, of course, equals 1,000 years, if you recall our last video. So these people are having a hard time. However, the Father, before they get thrown out, gives us the Bible's second prophecy, and that is to be found and noted when we go back to Bereshit, Genesis 3:15, and that is the judgment of the serpent, where the Father says to the serpent, Yahweh the Almighty said to thy serpent, I will put enmity between thee and the woman. Some of you don't like the Old English, so let's take a look at the Revised Standard American version of the same thing. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. This is a biblical prophecy. However, it's, of course, because it's from the Father, a lot deeper than you can imagine. And the first thing we want to take a look at is a seed. A seed, and where is this seed going to come from? It says it's coming from the woman, between the woman and your seed, between her seed and your seed. However, a woman doesn't have a seed. Do you remember what this was? This was our 14th letter, called the Noon. And it carried with it, as you've been seeing through all our presentations, the meaning of life and action. So a woman doesn't have a seed, but he does. And it sounds a little confusing right now. However, in order for a seed to grow up into a full-size person, they're both needed, aren't they? So it's going to be in this way that the Father is going to use the man and the woman, and somehow a child is going to be born. We see from this gender right here that it is going to be a male child. And that child someday will grow up and he will bruise your head of the serpent. In other words, crush it. So from this moment onward, the serpent knows that someday, somehow, these two are going to have a child that's going to grow up and crush his head. And this is going to be the adventure we're all on from this moment onward. But I want you to see what we're up against, because since these two have been stripped of Holy Spirit, and they're only made, form, breathe, and they die. But the enemy is not a serpent. The enemy is a created being. He is a spiritual being. And in this, we need to once again take a look at who he really is. And I'd like to go back, for it's of worth, to take a look at this. And Messiah himself tells us about this again in Luke chapter 4, verse 5. And the devil, taking him up into a high mountain, showed him all the kingdoms of the world in a moment of time. And the devil said to him, all this power I will give you, and the glory of them, for they have been delivered unto me, and to whomever I will give it. If thou therefore will worship me, they shall be thine. And Paul, the Apostle Paul, in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 10, again says, put on the whole armor of the Almighty, that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against rulers of darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. So, with this said, this is their opposition. And to understand this, we have to take a look at if the enemy has offered the Messiah all the kingdoms of the world, if he would but worship him, and he didn't take him up on his offer, because he is the seed that someday will crush his head, but not yet. But we find out through the course of our history along the timeline that many men had taken the enemy up on his offer, and indeed do worship Satan. And again, if it can be tracked and measured, it can be read. To see how men worship the enemy, it's necessary, of course, to put it on the timeline and see some of the prime historical examples. And what more appropriate symbol or image to begin with than a satyr? Very common in the Greek period, a hairy goat on two legs playing a flute, kind of like the Pied Piper leading his hypnotized flock down the road where they really don't want to go to. As we get along the timeline, of course, we come into Nimrod. Nimrod is going to be Bereshit 10, and after the flood, the world will again regress into chaos, and a tyrant will arise in the form of Nimrod, the mighty hunter. And as I suggested once before, not so much of Yahweh, but against Yahweh. And he is going to have dominion over the earth with his first city called Babel, as well as others soon after that. But within these cultures, in order to consolidate power, it's necessary to get your subjects to believe in something, obviously something that is beneficial to the leadership, whether man or woman. And it's in this that Nimrod will go on to have Semiramis and Tammuz, his son, and that is a whole story in itself, which we'll save for another video. Progressing down the timeline, the gods, of course, the first primary god that we had originally focused in on was Bel of Babel, the very name of the city, also called Marduk, and obviously necessary in order to have progeny and continuation, you would need a female goddess as well. So male and female goddesses were very common throughout the entire primitive period of the planet. However, the female goddess is something I'd like to focus in on, because we're going to see this popping up again and again. Ashtarte, Cybele, Diana, Artemis, Isis being the most famous out of all of them. And why? Because the goats, which I refer to as the Satanist, and going back to our first little satire at the very beginning, the rulers that do follow Satan
also have their own biblical prophecy, which is going to be another video. It's going to be called the Phoenix. And in this, they expect a world leader to show up someday too. And like Adam and Eve, they need a woman. And so the woman, only not the Father's woman that he is going to give his holy seed to, but in the complete opposite, a woman that the enemy will use, here too referred to as the woman. As we had discussed in a previous video about Daniel's fourth beast, the alternation that we had discussed in Revelations chapter 17, verse 8, where it said, "The beast that you saw was, and it is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit and go to perdition." Well, the beast that was is here the Roman Empire. And we see its eagle standards, and that will drag on throughout history right into the period of the woman, because when the beast is not, the woman rises. And then in the very last days, the beast rises again, only this time it has two eyes because it is 666. But in order to understand the woman, we have to go back to the beginning of the chapter 17, and we pick it up in verse 1. And the angel says, "Come to me, and I will show you the judgment of the great whore, which sitteth upon many waters, with whom the kings and queens of the earth have committed fornication." That means spiritual deception. "And the inhabitants of the world have become drunk with the wine of her fornication." False religious doctrines is what it's really talking about. So we see this as we progress down the timeline. And one of the more infamous doctrines is going to be picked up in the book of Acts through a false disciple called Nicholas. Nicholas will go on to become some type of big wig in the church of Pergamos, somewhere about 100, 150, 170 AD, and he will lead that church into all kinds of sin and debauchery. However, it is that very person that the Catholics will saint hundreds of years later and make him into Saint Nicholas. And through time, of course, through the Catholic Church, this whore of Revelation 17 and false doctrine, it will evolve into Christmas and Santa Claus, which of course is only Satan Claus, isn't it? Santa spelled backwards. So we see progressing down the timeline that the kings and queens of the world definitely are courting the Vatican, and the Vatican needs them in order to protect it. So especially since the Roman Empire fell apart, she no longer had its great armies to patrol and to keep her intact. So they needed something else. They needed to control the very souls of men. And they did this through their many false doctrines. Matter of fact, when we come to the Vatican itself and we look up into its arched cathedral ceilings of gold, they eulogize and lift up the dragon himself. He may not be a red dragon in this case, but he is a golden dragon with a red background, of which we saw early in Revelation 13. The dragon, the serpent, Satan, the devil. All right, we see that. We see it also in the very emblems of the aristocracy of Europe. When we look at the emblem of the British Empire, it actually is Revelation 13, where it says, and the beast which I saw was unto a leopard, and his feet were on the feet of a bear, and his mouth the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him power and seat and great authority. However, this isn't enough for today, and we see the enemy progressing into what we look like. His people are what we look like. They dress like we do, but it's always the same thing, because out of all of these cultures, you will know them by their fruit. Here is one of the Masons' logos that they incorporate within it, of course, the goat, and he has 6 points, and if we were to line them up, it would form a hexagram. However, he includes, or they include within this, the Jewish menorah, their Jewish star, as well as the so-called Christian fish. So we're starting to see, again, in order to control men, you need to control their very belief system. Here we see the Papa here, and he's got his little Horus hat on. Again, I had told you earlier that we will someday talk about the story of the Phoenix. And within that story, the hero in it, the future world leader, Horus himself, that's Osiris, Isis, and Horus, their son to be born, like Adam and Eve, their son to be born, only this is the enemy's son. He wears the Horus hat, of which Santa Claus likes to wear. And then finally, keeping in vogue where we are today, they again have got you all believing what they want you to believe, as many of you believe that you have come from animals. And if you are indeed only made, formed, and you breathe like any other beast, then you are an animal, and if you believe this, then you will be treated like one. And then finally, we see the same scenario, only this time manifested in the dollar bill. Remember Bel, which will morph into the Lord, Baal, and here it indeed is Bill, the dollar bill. So we do see within all this that the enemy is worshipped, and he has many names and many symbols.
Getting back to our scriptures, Bereshit 3:15, the curse of the serpent, and Yahweh said to the serpent, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. And he shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. This is a translation from the 1953 Revised Standard Version in 1953. Now, it says here, the translation from the original tongues, being the version set forth in 1611, revised in 1881, 1885, 1901, and 1952. Another revision has taken place since then. I used to use this scripture, this version of the scripture all the time, but since the last version it is so watered down, I don't even bother with it. But I want to bring this to everybody's attention because there's something very significant here, and that is there is a disputation within the Christian ranks as to what this verse is really talking about. As it says here, I will put enmity between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. That's what it says in the Protestant version. But the Catholic version, at this point we're turning to the Jerusalem Bible, states this. Okay, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and your offspring and her offspring. It will crush your head, and you shall strike its heel. So they are changing this to it, and they're changing the second pronoun to its. And the question has to be, which is correct? Well, if we take a look at this, something is taking place. Catholic Church is a much bigger church than most of the Protestant churches, and it certainly is a lot older because we can find it way down here, say 340, okay? So this is the Catholic version, somewhere about 340. And in the footnotes, it has this, to this particular pronoun in question. It states this. And the Latin version has a feminine pronoun, she will crush. And since in the messianic interpretation of our text, the Messiah and his mother appear together, the pronoun has been taken to refer to Mary. This application has become the current version of the church. So the question is, we all of a sudden have a problem. It is either his or it is her seed shall bruise the head of the enemy. And the question is, it's one or the other. The bottom line to all of this is there is a man, Adam, and his wife, Eve. And they're going to have a child. And the question is, will it be a boy or a girl? Well, let's consider some other versions, scriptural versions of this. This is a messianic version from some believers down in South Africa. And here's what they state. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall crush his heel. So, we have another version that is favoring the boy. On one side, we have the Catholic. And by the way, I would like to also include the Orthodox Christians, the Orthodox Greeks. And by the way, I'm half Greek, so I know what's happening in that church. This particular Bible is interesting. It came into my hands a while back. It's called the Geneva Bible, and it's actually older than the King James. King James would be about here, 1611, King James. This is probably the most common scripture that almost all the Protestants glean from. But this particular one is actually older than King James. It's about 50 years older, and it was printed in Geneva, Switzerland. There's much to be said about that. This is what it has to say. It says, and I will also put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. He shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. His heel. The English is so old in this that it actually is spelled heel with an E on it. Geneva, Switzerland was an interesting place around the 1600s because it was one of the few places left in Western Europe that the Catholic Church did not have an overwhelming grip on. And for about 50 years, hiding in the mountains of Switzerland, English, French, German biblical scholars got together and they printed the first English translation of the scriptures. And it's come to us today as the Geneva Bible. Connecting the dots, I'd like to just put the Geneva Bible here for reference. Geneva Bible. I used to live in Western Europe on and off in the 80s, and forgive my map, this is Switzerland. But for my part, I used to live over here in France. This is Geneva right here. And what drew me to this particular part of the world was that I was an avid skier, and I knew a lot of French people at this time, as well as other Europeans. And these are the Alps. Way down here, you have Italy, of course, and you would have Rome, wouldn't you? Okay. Well, Rome was preoccupied with other things, which gave this Geneva Bible a chance to germinate here. And this will be a big impetus for the Reformation that is taking place. Over here, of course, you would have Austria. I used to have some friends in Innsbruck, and so I would travel quite frequently through Geneva by train over to Innsbruck and back again. So this is taking place here. How does King James factor into this scenario? Well, we have England over here, and we have King James. But King James actually was a Scottish man who came from Scotland up here. And now he's the English king over here. Wales is over here, and of course Ireland is here. And James saw that Bibles were starting to get printed left and right, and it wasn't really anything he could do about it. So he comes out in 1611 with his authorized version. So what does that tell you right away? That if it's not authorized, you can't have it. Well, that's not going to fly very well, and a lot of people decided to leave. And there were some people, we would eventually call them Puritans, pilgrims, that left England because they weren't happy campers with King James. And by the way, if you were a dissident, whether you were a Christian or not, he would kill you, like all the other kings. So by 1620, we get this dissident group of pilgrims heading to the New World. And they're going to end up right over here in Massachusetts, about 1620. So we have the Pilgrims. And by the way, it should be noted that when they came here in 1620, they could have brought along a King James Version, but they didn't want one. Anyone who knew what was going on in England would definitely prefer the Geneva Bible. So they came to America, they braved the cold, the harsh winters, and survived, and they used the Geneva Bible. So we have New England, 6 states. Massachusetts is here, and if we just go a little bit farther south, we'll end up where I'm presently doing this video, in the state of Connecticut. And there's another town that I would like you to consider, and it's called New Haven, Connecticut. And it has every bit as much to do with the biblical translations and where they're coming from as anything else. So follow me and let's go on to my tour of Yale University.
Beginning our tour of New Haven, it is the town green that is the primary part of the city, and the university parallels it. It is surrounded by Protestant churches with a Greek architecture that was very common in the 1830s. Nonetheless, New Haven was a major destination for Europeans, as Boston and New York was. And this area was developed very quickly. And as the new country wanted to emulate civilization, they started bringing down granite from Vermont, actually having real sidewalks, cobbled stones, and of course, they eventually got into big buildings. And if any of you have been to England before, Oxford or Cambridge, this is very much a look-alike. They wanted a major university, and of course, they got it in the form of Yale, and the only one that could pay for this was, of course, the extremely wealthy to send their children here. Okay, as we notice on all of these older European-style buildings, they have gargoyles. And I think the Christians still haven't decided among themselves whether they're actually demons or trying to keep demons out. Nonetheless, this is very characteristic of these buildings. Here we see a eagle standing upon the world with an anchor, because after all, this culture was now growing into its own, and this will be part of its image, the eagle. Inside a lot of the buildings, they have kind of closed courtyards for contemplations, gardens, if you will. And I can just imagine being a student of a Greek philosopher sitting under a lemon tree and discussing all the virtues of what a proper man and woman should be. After all, a lot of these universities were for people who were largely just about literate, and they didn't have so many concentrations of majors. But if a person could get out and read and write and do some mathematics, he was well ahead of almost everybody. So as we progress down the line, we come down to finally the library. And I have to admit that the facade of this building is really quite impressive. As we look at it, we see to the left carvings of ancient man, possibly caveman. The next panel is Egyptian hieroglyphics, of course, with an Egyptian eagle in the middle and possibly a Phoenician galley beneath it. A Assyrian Babylonian king, half bull, half man, that's winged, which the Babylonians were noted for. And then we have our cuneiform to the right of that, and finally the Hebrew to the far right. The next panel, I'm not going to guess on it because I'm not quite sure what the script is, but the one following it to the right is definitely Greek. Then in the middle we have the Azteca Quetzalcoatl flying serpent god with an eagle underneath it. Wisdom, as it's depicted on the dollar bill upper right-hand corner, but you need a microscope for that one. And below that, we see the she-wolf, which, of course, is nursing Romulus and Remus, which will be the beginners of Rome. And then to the right of that, we have Chinese glyphs, and then Mayan to the furthest right. I used to do tours in Central America. Okay, now we're finally inside the building itself. It certainly is a marvelous building. A lot of it is pseudo, though. It looks as if it is stone, but it's really cement. I believe the building actually was only built in the 30s. The stained glass itself is really marvelous, but it's not real stained glass like you would find in Europe. And in the main corridor, as you walk into the building, you're greeted by this glorified image of Mary. And as you Catholics call her, the Queen of the Apostles. But wasn't this presentation about going over Genesis 3:15 to find out who really is going to be the seed of the woman? Is it going to be a boy or is it going to be a girl? Well, this one kind of weighs in favor of the female of being the progeny of Mary, but let's take a closer look as we move along. Next to this, we have a traveling exhibit in this library, and this time happened to have a cornerstone ceremony in 1928. And of course, who would be the ones to lay the stones but the Freemasons, of course. Now, I can tell you, I used to work for real Masons. I used to make the cement when I was going to college in the summertime, and that was a hard job. And these Freemasons don't even have calluses on their hands, so they're not real Masons, they are Freemasons. But let's continue the tour and head down the street, and eventually we come to High Street. And High Street is our street that we want to be on for the next exhibit. And we finally come to the infamous Skull and Bones Lodge 322 building. No windows, no signs, no address. But because we all know it is 322, we know this. Hillary went across the street to school when she went here. And I've heard recently that the living Skull and Bones members not too long ago had a vote on it that they would actually admit women. So it's hard to know because that's the game. Nobody's supposed to know who is a Skull and Bones or Skull and Bones person. However, they do have one thing in common, and that is they seem to always like to depict the goat sign. And this is the goat sign. Everybody's doing it, from the Hollywood movie stars to the Pope to the president. And a goat is the opposite of a sheep. Didn't somebody once say goats to my left and sheep to my right? And finally, ending this tour on a better day, this is a gate at the campus cemetery. And it is a mock Egyptian hieroglyphic presentation. And it has a Egyptian eagle at the top, double-headed serpents around an orb. How else could the sun fly? And for any of you who have been to Washington, D.C., and been in the Washington Monument, you will notice right above the elevator the same symbol. Okay, that's it for now. Let's go back to the board and put it all together.
Finishing up with this question on Bereshit 3:15, is it a boy or is it a girl that's going to be of the seed? And I will put enmity between you, the serpent, and between your seed and her seed, the woman. He will bruise your head and you shall bruise his heel. What is it? Is it a his or is it a he? Well, we've already taken a look at, the Authorized Version says he, the Geneva Bible says him, and the Catholic Bible says her or means her. But isn't it always best to go back to the beginning? Don't we always go back to the beginning? And we do. And let's go back to the real beginning. And we're now using the interlinear Hebrew-Greek scriptures. And it says that, and I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. He will bruise your head, and you will bruise his heel. So, this is the correct version. That is not correct. But you're not out of the woods yet. Remember the goats? The goats. What about them? Well, We discussed before the skull and bones fraternity at Yale, and one of its latest presidents was our good old George W. Bush. George Bush. He was a fraternity man there. You know, I thought it was funny when he ran for re-election against Kerry, who was the Democrat, but of course they were both skull and bones men anyway, but the public wasn't supposed to know that. The media wasn't so big in identifying this. But the thing that makes Skull and Bones interesting and for our consideration is the lodge number of this fraternity is 322. And if we take a look at our scriptures and we go to Bereshit 3:22, we're going to notice that it says that, and Yahweh Almighty said, behold, the man is become as one of us. Meaning, for the goat, that they are one of the Elohim, which is plural, which they interpret as gods. So, these people, these privileged, wealthy people, go to Skull and Bones, sending their sons there, coming out to become gods, or the real interpretation is mighty ones. And it's in this respect that we have to look at the fruit of Mr. Bush. And if we look at his record, we will see that from 9/11 onward, we're going to get the Iraqi War. Still haven't won that one, have you? No. And then after that, in 2008, he's going to have the biggest bank bailout in U.S. history. Many of you are not recovering from the housing crash since then, are you? So when we put all this together, someone once said, you will know them. Know them by their fruit. And to give you an answer in relation to the goats on my left and my sheep on my right, I believe it's in Matthew 25, I think it is. And if we were to go there and turn to verse 31, it says, when the Son of Man shall come. Well, we know that Messiah came once, he's got to come again, and we know when he does come, it's going to be something what we interpret as World War III. So we know that he's coming about that time, and he says, when the Son of Man shall come in his glory, and all the holy angels with him, then they shall sit upon the throne of his glory, and before him shall be gathered all the nations, and he shall separate them one from another, as a shepherd divideth his sheep from the goats. And he shall set the sheep on his right hand, and the goats on his left. And then shall the king say unto them on his right, come you, my blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. But for the goats, Then he shall say also unto them on my left, depart from me, you cursed, into the everlasting fire. And the day of 9/11, George was in a little elementary school somewhere in Florida, and he was reading a book. Anybody remember the name of the book? It was My Pet Goat. My Pet Goat. Again, you will know them by their fruit. Finishing up our presentation, how Satan works, again we take a look at Revelation chapter 17, verse 1 and 2. And I will show unto you the judgment of the great whore that sitteth upon many waters, the Vatican, with whom the kings, the dukes, the knights, the earls, the queens, the presidents of the earth have committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth have become made drunk with the wine of her fornication. Lies, lies, lies. And we're going to show you that despite the top of the pyramid being controlled by the goats, that black is strong, but it cannot keep out the light. So it's in this respect. Follow us on our next video, and that's going to be entitled, The Father Begins His Work. The Father begins His work, as you shall see.